Thanks again, Bill, for being on this morning. We're running a few minutes ahead of schedule, but I believe we have all three of our other two participants in the environmental justice discussion. So if we're ready to move forward, can we go ahead and shift to the next? Perfect. So the next discussion will be about DEQ's environmental justice program and its Title VI program. The two other folks who will be joining me in this discussion are Caitlin Roanhouse. She is a principal engineer with Geosyntec Consultants in Wilmington, and Renee Kramer, who is the department's environmental justice coordinator. All right. Do we have the video for all three of the panelists this morning? Yep, there we go. Sorry. This is my first time at this. So the first thing you'll see on the screen for everyone that we'd ask you to participate in is a poll regarding everyone's relative knowledge regarding environmental justice. And I'll note that while folks are filling this out, it was roughly 25 years ago this summer that I was an intern in Florida Power and Light's Environmental Services Department. And to these folks' credit, they invited the interns to participate in their annual department retreat. And I remember them talking about a number of different issues that were front and center in the 1990s. But I remember hearing about this topic, and it strikes me that it's a very similar discussion back in the mid 90s as it is now, that we all sort of have an intuitive sense of what it means. But I don't know that we have a real concrete sense of what it means and how to think about it in the context of permitting decisions. So what we're going to do is, where are we in terms of the poll results? There we go. So roughly 80% are saying that they've got some knowledge, and roughly 10% none, and roughly 10% saying significant. So what we're intending to do first is jump into a brief discussion that I'm going to lead that just maybe defines terms a little bit for everyone. And if we could go to the slide presentation. Is that up, or are we seeing the slides? There we go. So if we could go ahead and advance to the next slide. So let's start by trying to define, well, what is environmental justice? And environmental justice really refers to concern over the presence of multiple industrial facilities and or contaminated sites in close proximity to one another, the related socioeconomic, human health, and environmental effects that nearby residents experience as a result of those facilities, and the desire to give these communities a voice in attempting to abate some of the adverse effects that these existing uses can cause, as well as give them a voice in attempting to abate additional impact that results from the construction of new or expansion of existing facilities. Next slide. Now, contrast that to the concept of Title VI under the Civil Rights Act, which is a little bit more narrowly focused. Title VI is directed towards prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin, those three specific factors, and that prohibition applies to any entity that receives federal funds. And it's important to note that that prohibition applies not only to the DEQ programs that are directly funded with federal dollars, it applies to all operations throughout the department. And when you're thinking about discrimination in the Title VI context, it can either take the form of intentional discrimination, or what is more appropriate, or what is really more relevant in the environmental context, of disparate adverse impacts that result from a facially neutral decision. Next slide, please. Now, the key thing to understand about both environmental justice and Title VI more specifically is that complying with health-based environmental standards, something like the ambient air quality standards or the water quality standards, is not enough to avoid analyzing whether disparate adverse impacts are going to occur to a Title VI protected community or to a broader environmental justice community. Historically, that was the case. And it's important to understand what that policy was and when it was changed. And it relates, or it started really with, or the best explanation of it is from a decision in 1999 regarding a Title VI complaint known as the Select Steel decision. And in that case, what EPA ultimately said was that a PSD permit associated with a steel mill would not cause adverse impact so long as there was still going to be compliance with the applicable ambient air quality standards. So even if there were disparate impacts, EPA's view in 1999 was that those impacts, as disparate as they might be to the folks living nearby, were not adverse and therefore didn't trigger a Title VI concern. EPA proposed revoking that rebuttable presumption in 2013, and then ultimately did in a guidance document in 2017 during the last days of the Obama administration. Next slide, please. And it's also important to know that there's a recent Fourth Circuit decision that also rejected the Select Steel approach. And what the court found, again, was that demonstrating that a project was going to comply with the NAAQS was not enough to conclude that there was no disparate impact as a result of a permit for a new minor source. And the court got to this issue and ultimately remanded the permit at issue, in large part because of the broad language that was used in terms of the things that Virginia DEQ could consider, and that language was in its SIP. So I'd also note briefly that the court rejected the scope of DEQ's investigation regarding the existence of an environmental justice community as well. Next slide, please. So what you're going to hear today then is a discussion of how DEQ, North Carolina DEQ, evaluates these EJ and Title VI concerns. And there's really two key components to this. First is using public data and site-specific investigations, if they're necessary, to determine if a location is experiencing the socioeconomic, human health, or environmental conditions that might suggest that an EJ community or a Title VI community is present in the area of a proposed project. And if that location is what I'll sort of generally call an EJ community, then the second step is engaging in enhanced public outreach efforts to determine the level of the community's interest in the project, and if there is significant interest in it, to create meaningful opportunities for that community to participate in the permitting process. Next slide, please. So where we're going next is we're first going to see a demonstration of what DEQ uses as one of its primary first steps in identifying EJ communities, which is the DEQ community mapping tool. Then we're going to have a Q&A session where Caitlin and I are going to try to draw out how this process works in the real world. And then we will hopefully have some time for audience questions at the end. But I'd ask folks to please keep in mind that this is a rapidly changing field. President Biden has issued 4 executive orders since the inauguration that deal in a substantive way with the notion of environmental justice. So please understand that DEQ may not have final answers to every one of your questions. So with that, I think I'm ready to turn it over to Renee.
Thanks, Sean. I'm assuming everybody can hear me okay. Let me just pull up my screen to share. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start out, jump right in with the new-ish DEQ community mapping system. So you can access this by going to our websites under Outreach and Education. and then environmental justice. And so then you come to this first page. Before jumping right in, you can kind of get a little background information. There's a glossary of terms. Whoops, sorry, everybody. There is a glossary of terms. There's a how-to user guide. The glossary kind of includes some of all of the data that is pulled into the mapping system. It's all been data that has already been publicly available. We have just pulled it into one easily accessible location. And then kind of how to use it. We also have a survey here where folks can provide input on additional data layers that they might like to see in a future version of the mapping system. And then down here, we have state and nationwide mapping tools to see what other states are doing in a similar fashion and how they differ. They're all slightly different, and they all kind of get it similar but different data sets and ideas. So that can be really interesting if you have a few minutes to kind of see what other states are doing as well. So I'm going to jump right in to the mapping system. It might take a couple minutes to load. Okay, so the first thing that you will see is the state with all 100 counties, and then some dark shaded orange areas. These are going to be your state designated tribal statistical areas. So this might indicate a presence of high Native American population and tribal consultation that might need to occur for project specific. So down here is really where the bulk of the items would be. I guess before that, you might want to search your address. For this demonstration, I'm just going to zoom in to Raleigh, just to give folks an idea of what we're looking at. All of the permits and incidents will populate as you zoom in, and it can kind of be a lot at first, but the yellow ones are underground storage tanks or incidents, and those are pretty common. So it's kind of important to pull up the legend and see what we're looking at. So that's one way to look at what we're seeing. The other way is the info summary, which will actually update as you zoom in and out or pan across. So this helps the user define their own community. And that is a really key piece that we were striving for when we developed this, is that we are not trying to define anyone's community. Of course, everybody has their own definitions of what their community means to them. And so this really is allowing that user to define this themselves. So here we also have some environmental layers that you can add, such as managed conservation areas, which that would be things like nature preserves or conservation easements. And then we also have flood zones that you can turn on or off. So I'll turn those back off. You can change the base map, of course, and then you can turn on or off any of the layers if you're not interested in certain layers, such as underground storage tank incidents may not be of interest to you. So the next thing we will do is a little screening. This is a really useful, quick tool to get some information straight. Just pull it and go. Let's see. So if I draw a little triangle around, I guess I did St. Augustine's University, we will report on 1 mile, and I'll zoom out a little bit more. And this is going to do the same thing that the info summary did. It's going to tell you how many permits are in that radius. And then from here, you can print that document, and it will print out a PDF for you to just print and take with you if that's what you're interested in. It's pulling up a map right now. It also has this summary down here of an overview of the number of each type of permit or incident. And then it goes into a little bit more detail about the name and type of permit for each of those. So I went ahead and did one already, so we didn't have to wait for it because it can take a few minutes to load. So this is what it's going to look like at the end when you pull that map. There we go. Okay, so the next phase, this is kind of a two-part tool. The next thing is the environmental justice tool. And so what we have to access that on this is just if you click on a block group, it will tell you the total population and then the approximate, well, it's approximate because we're using American Community Survey, which are actually estimates calculated from census data, but that will give you the minority population and the low income population. And so that's just really interesting to see. Like for Raleigh, I'm down here and it's 91% minority and 80% low income. And if I was just wondering what it might look like up here, whoops. Okay, 0% minority and 12% low income. So you can just really get an idea of how it might change based off of where you are and just give you that initial environmental justice definition is minority low income. And so that will give you that initial overview. But if you want to dive a little deeper into the environmental justice tool, you can do that and it will pull up. One thing that is cool is that we have the statewide demographics down here compared to the area that you have selected. It's going to highlight the block group that I clicked on so that it shows me where I am, and then it's going to compare that over here to the demographics of the state. If I want to see the facilities, whoops, in an area, that's not supposed to happen. Sorry about that. It's supposed to be the same area on the map and will show me the facilities there, but some little glitch may be happening. And then it also has the sensitive receptors, which are things like churches, hospitals, schools, things like that. The other things down here, we have race and ethnicity. If you go over here, you can compare the annual household income. You can see the median household income. And again, these update as you zoom in or out or pan across different areas. So it's a dynamic tool and it will constantly update as you are defining or trying to compare, look around the state. Then we have homeowner status, renters versus owners, dependent populations, which gets at the age, and then limited English proficiency, percent that does not speak English very well. Looks like it's pretty high in this area. And then a percent with a college degree, which is really important when you're thinking about outreach materials and how you are presenting those to folks. Then over here we have our health dashboard, which has, again, we compare it to the state average, and we have heart disease deaths, we have cancer and diabetes. It does not break it down more than the broad overview here. The other important thing to note about the health dashboard is that this is on the county level. It is not on the block group level like the other demographics are because of data availability. Down here we have preterm birth rate, infant death rate, and child mortality rate. And we have stroke and cardiovascular disease. Then we have asthma hospitalizations. And then the last thing we have is number of physicians, which is one very, very basic initial proxy for access to healthcare. But of course, there's a lot more that goes into access to healthcare than just the number of physicians. But that overall is our mapping system in a very quick nutshell. I hope I didn't take too long going through that. Sean, I will pitch it back to you.
I'll grab it from here. Thank you so much, Renee, for that demonstration. And thanks for being here to answer our questions. That's a lot of information. So thank you for that. Now that we've seen the CMS or the community mapping system in action, let's jump in. So based on the CMS analysis originally, talk us through what might happen next for the EJ process.
Yeah, so the very first step in our analysis is really that initial percent minority and percent low income that I showed on the first step of the mapping system. So we'll use the CMS for that, but we'll also use the EPA's environmental justice screening tool, EJ Screen. So we do that to kind of see if it warrants additional steps which if it does, we continue and we'll go into our our draft EJ report. And there we'll look at the environmental justice guidelines from the EPA and NEPA that flag a community that is 10% or more comparison to the county or the state, and 50% or more minority, and then 5% or more compared to the county or state for poverty. And so those are kind of the initial things that we're looking for, and may go into the draft EJ report.
Okay, so for the audience, if the community surrounding a proposed project is, say, 50% or more minority, or if the incidence of poverty surrounding that community is 5% or more higher, that site would need to be evaluated from an EJ standpoint. Is that correct?
That's correct. So what we do is we, to kind of simplify, we would define the local community as the census tracts. So just one designation is our CMS is in the block group, but in our draft EJ reports, we use census tract, which is slightly larger than the block group, but has, it's just a matter of data accessibility. And then we also look at the project radius, which would be between 1 and 3 miles. And we would define those as the local community, and we would compare that to the county and the state data. And then we would take a deeper dive to look at some of the additional criteria that goes into an EJ report.
Renee, can you tell us what actually goes into an EJ report?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is kind of an overview of the permit application that was submitted, including facility emissions overview. And we try to do a simple overview that is easily understood by community members who might be interested in learning about what the project is or what it might mean for their community, but may not be able to really understand a full permit application or draft permit, because those can be really complicated documents. And then we go into the comparison of the local area demographics to the county and the state. And for that, we include race and ethnicity, age and sex, disability, poverty, household income, and limited English proficiency. Then we go into a county health assessment, and then we pull the surrounding sensitive receptors that I mentioned earlier, churches, schools, hospitals, and then local industrial sites as well that we pull using the screening tool that I showed you from the community mapping system. And then we close it out with next steps for community outreach plans based off of the data in the EJ report.
So, and I realize this is still maybe a little bit of a work in progress, but so assuming the EJ report is conducted, can you tell us sort of where it goes from there? What's the process from there?
Yeah, so as I said, the conclusion of the draft report is going to be the outreach strategies. And so we would go from there to start those outreach steps. The way that we pull those are actually from a public participation plan that we have. And we would kind of consult that and see what might best fit this community, such as additional flyers with simplified project information for them to understand, or translation or things, excuse me, or things of that nature. So the next step is really additional outreach and gauging community interest in that project.
Okay, so the obvious question that everyone wants to know, what are the types of permits that are, subject to this process?
Yeah, so we have a nice list of qualifying permits that are going to be your bigger permits, and I'll read through those in a second. But just also, we have a division director's discretion, which is important to remember because that can pull some of the smaller permits that may not reach the level based off of this list, but based off of additional information such as the community composition or public interest. Excuse me, we may go ahead and continue and check out the environmental justice portion for that community. So for the Division of Air Quality, we have new major source of hazardous air pollutants or criteria pollutants, and major modification at a PSD facility that results in major emissions. For the Division of Waste Management, we have landfills and other disposal facilities, transfer stations, incinerators, commercial hazardous waste treatment, and new and substantial amendments to the above. For the Division of Water Quality, new animal feeding operations, new or expanding NPDES municipalities above 1 million gallon daily threshold, new or expanding NPDES industrials at the division director's discretion, and 401 buffers at the division director's discretion. And then for the Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources, we have new and modified permit applications for mining operations above 100 total acres of permit boundary, and mining operations greater than 25 acres with mineral processing requiring a general or individual stormwater permit and or other state or federal waste management permits relevant to the mining operation.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that. I totally got all of it. All right, just to help clarify a little bit, because that was a long list, does this include modifications to existing facilities or renewals of existing permits? And, same line of questioning, does this apply to major modifications or also to minor permit modifications? Can you kind of clarify all that for us?
Right. So as I kind of said, at my preface of that list is that there is that division director's discretion. And so because we use a two-pronged approach of looking at the community composition as well as the type of permit, it may end up being that a smaller permit modification application would end up getting triggered for the EJ process. Also, if it's a completely just standard renewal, it may trigger the EJ process if it has never gone through the EJ process. But again, those would all be things on the division director's discretion and not what we are focusing on as indicated from that list of really new or significant expansions.
Okay, I guess one of the other questions that a lot of folks are going to want to understand is how does the EJ process and the enhanced community outreach, how does that marry up with the traditional process for applying for a permit, getting a draft permit out, and then getting to the point of a final permit?
Right. So what we are aiming to do is really work within all of the timeframes set out by regulations and statutes. However, there are some times when a timeline might take a little bit longer, either from an EJ perspective or from other additional information requests. So that's kind of a tough one because it's all on a project specific basis. We also have project and division specific requirements for that timeline. So ultimately, the answer is that we try to go along with that process set out in the regulation and statute. There is, if a project is triggered, that it might warrant an additional public process, that it may be optional. That might take a little bit longer, but for the most part, we're shooting to stay with the regulations.
So I assume that DEQ sees an opportunity to add additional data fields to this mapping tool over time as new fields develop or are considered important. I assume that's correct. Would those additional data fields be considered factors in deciding to move forward to the next process or to the EJ process?
Yeah, so as I showed everybody at the very beginning, we have that survey that is open always, and we are always soliciting feedback for additional data layers as they become available or as we become aware of them. And so yes, we would love to have that opportunity as we become aware of those. As far as whether or not the new fields would become factors in deciding of moving from one step to the next, probably not. I mean, it would really depend on what that layer is and what that data was telling us. So that one is definitely up in the air, but depending on what it is. But for the most part, I think the main things are really that initial minority and low income.
And Renee, this is a pretty powerful tool in terms of a GIS system. And does the does the state and DEQ, do you see other uses for this mapping tool above and beyond just what we're talking about for today's purposes?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really, really important for the mapping system to be utilized at various levels. I think the most important one is for local governments to look at what is in their community, what's in their area, and what they might want to have it look like moving forward. Same with community members. It's really powerful to see what is already in your community, and from there kind of plan what do you want your community to look like moving forward. So if other folks do these analyses earlier in the process of recruiting businesses and different industries, I think that's really, really important to not wait for DEQ to run this at the last step of the state permitting process.
So for the audience, let's just jump through a couple of examples just to help make this more concrete, if you don't mind. So an easy one is, let's say we have a new facility that's going to be constructed in a community where English is not their primary language. In that scenario, we would expect that we would have public outreach where we would account for that issue, such as a public meeting with a translator or publish information that's in multiple languages. That's correct.
Yes, yes. So we are definitely committed to providing information in different languages. I mentioned our public participation plan earlier. We have kind of a sister document that is a language access plan for limited English proficiency situations where we consider what to do and what information to make accessible into what languages when we encounter situations such as that. It may be translating pertinent documents. It may go so far as having interpretation services and having a separate line where we have a real-time interpreter on a public meeting. It does kind of depend. There's that spectrum. It's all on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, we really worked on enhancing. We have an internal translation team, and so we're really working on enhancing our public outreach in different languages.
How about the decision to have additional public meetings? Would that depend on the response that DEQ gets initially on the initial outreach in the community, such as public flyers or mailings, et cetera?
Yeah, it definitely can. It can be determined maybe by division director's discretion. It can also be from community members who have provided a lot of feedback that maybe they don't understand the permitting process and would like more information. For example, over the summer, I believe we had a community that was really concerned about an air quality permit because they really did not feel like they understood the permitting process. And so with in conjunction with the EPA, we actually hosted a small community meeting about, it was like a permitting 101 workshop so that they could really understand the way that the permitting process works and kind of how to submit public comments in a more productive way. So yeah, I think that's definitely one way is the public and community response.
Sounds like it depends a bit. So let's do one more example. Let's say the EJ report identifies a Native American community and separately an economically disadvantaged community within a mile of the proposed facility. Would the first step be to contact the tribal leaders and the residents of that community by mail and attempt to gauge their concern with that project?
Right. So we have a really good relationship with the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, and we take government to government consultation very seriously. So we would definitely reach out to the tribal leaders and provide information to them about the project and about the opportunity to provide public comment on that. And then based off of if they're interested in more information, we may do a little bit more to provide them with the proper information so that they can comment accordingly. We also would then consult the public participation plan that I previously mentioned and see what other steps we would consider doing for that outreach.
So then it really is, it depends on, or how much further you go in this process really depends in large part on the initial response, sticking with the hypo, from the Native American community or the nearby residents. That's really going to drive the decision by both the applicant and DEQ of what happens next.
Right. So we would definitely, as I said, we consider that public participation plan. But we have had instances where we've provided information to the tribal leaders and have not received any questions back. And we just continued to make sure that they were reminded of the event, but of a public meeting, for example. But we didn't go into any additional educational opportunities for them in those instances because they did not seek out more information. But we've also had times where tribal leaders have come back and we've conducted more education about projects. And so, yeah, it's a case-by-case basis, and it depends on several things, such as the response and interest from our original efforts.
So assuming that there's a public concern that is voiced, the applicant can then attempt to at least consider that in the design of the project, correct?
Yeah, that is definitely a really great solution. There is something, I won't go too much into this right now, but there's something called community benefits agreements, which is really just an agreement between the community and the applicant. DEQ is not involved in that, but it can help if the applicant is aware of certain concerns from that community. It can be a really great way to help mitigate those concerns and move forward with the project.
So there's a lot of volume of information here. Is the department planning on putting out some sort of a comprehensive guidance document that would help people understand how this process works? And is there anything that you can tell us in terms of what DEQ expects in terms of timelines for the EJ process and how it interacts with the normal permitting process?
Yeah, so that's a great idea. We really want to help with any tools that will help make this project process easier. I think that is exhibited by our creation of the community mapping system to make this easier to applicants, to community members, to local governments. We're considering a more extensive guidance document. We do have the public participation plan that I mentioned that does outline a lot of these procedures, processes, and ideas. There is also a lot of guidance out there from the EPA on environmental justice that we look at and that we encourage others to look at as well for that. If you're more interested in some additional guidance documents. The timing is what you had also asked. If our hope is that the applicant would conduct outreach to the community at the same time that they're working on other pre-application planning, so that the community is already familiar with the project by the time the DEQ receives an application. And hopefully the community's concerns may have been addressed at that point, or at least are in discussion and aware of it. It can slow it down if the community has not heard of the project until DEQ posts our notice for public hearing or public comment. So we definitely encourage that to happen in concert with that pre-application process.
So does DEQ expect sort of over time that maybe these timelines and procedures become a little bit more standardized, or do you think that because of the nature of the analysis that we're talking about, that it's going to remain sort of a case-by-case proposition?
Yeah, the timelines, of course, are going to be dependent, as I said earlier, on the type of permit and the division. A lot of those are set out already, but the case-by-case nature of this is definitely going to kind of remain. There's not really a cookie-cutter approach for how to do this kind of outreach and considerations of environmental justice, so that it will always have a certain level of case-by-case consideration. But I definitely think, as you mentioned at the very beginning, the level of items coming out from the federal government are definitely an indication that there's a lot of attention on this. And so I don't know what's going to happen, but I would expect more procedures to be coming out.
So on that same issue of timing, to expedite this process, do you encourage applicants to take on their own, full EJ evaluation, or is that something that DEQ kind of wants to do in-house?
Yeah, I think that as I've indicated before, we really, really do encourage the applicant to have consider environmental justice and the community concerns throughout all steps from the very beginning of this process. And so if an applicant is interested, we've had more and more of this actually happen where an applicant is interested and have reached out and conducted their own EJ evaluations. And so, yeah, short answer, yes, we would encourage that.
So basically, the moral of the story is we suggest the applicants begin this evaluation as soon as possible.
Yep, absolutely. As I said, if a community is just hearing about a project at the DEQ permit application phase, which is really, they've already, at that point, you can assume they've already dealt with the local government, that has more potential to kind of have some hiccups or slow down the project. So we definitely encourage from the beginning as soon as possible.
Caitlin, we both worked on some of these, linear infrastructure projects or these large economic development projects before. And we've seen these situations where people will do their diligence ahead of time to try to avoid sensitive areas and try to limit the extent of the impact of their project. And it seems in a way that the same analysis and the same approach could be applied here as well. Don't you think?
I was thinking the same thing, Sean. And we, of course, do this all the time as consultants and as attorneys. We assist our clients with this. The parallel to the linear project is good. In that case, we would do a desktop evaluation and a site reconnaissance to identify some affected populations. In that case, it'd be a wetlands maybe, or endangered species. In this case, I certainly think that similar approach can be employed to better understand the EJ implications as early as maybe the siting process, or at least prior to the permitting process, to take into account those EJ communities.
The other thing that occurs to me is if you analogize the situation to NEPA for a minute, and you see these situations in which folks will try to propose mitigation in order to avoid needing to prepare a full EIS. And maybe this is a little bit different, but it's a similar thought process maybe, which says that if you do your homework ahead of time and evaluate what the community's concerns are going to be and build that message into what your proposal is, it seems like you're off on a much better foot with the community and with the department and in terms of efficiency.
Again, I totally agree. It seems prudent. And Renee, thanks again for kind of walking us through this, that we initiate conversations early with the community and focus on ways to address those concerns so that, they're raised in the permitting process, and we're showing the community and DEQ that, we're being proactive and that we're understanding that EJ is in fact part of the diligence process. And then of course, we're avoiding delays in construction of any facility or renewal of existing permit. And that's always great too.
I want to make sure we leave time for the Q&A, but I guess I would just note the last thing I'd say is that there certainly is going to be a challenge with how to do this due diligence or this added layer of due diligence in the context of an economic development deal, and sometimes the confidentiality concerns that come along with that. And to me, I mean, that feels like the substance of a webinar on its own. And folks, be on the lookout, I think, for something like that, because I think there's a lot more detail that the regulated community needs to think through about how we would actually implement this in the context of an economic development deal. There are 7 questions that have been posed to us here. And let me scroll back to the beginning and let's see.
Everyone save their questions from Bill for me.
Can you see them, Renee? Do you want to take them, or do you want me to read them out for the group, or what's the best way to do it?
If you don't mind reading them, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. The first one is, has the department considered development of a checklist of actions that an applicant could take in advance of the permit application so that when it enters the process, the actions that were taken by the applicant would be determined as sufficient and then reduce processing time?
Yeah, great question. So I think Pennsylvania has a checklist like that, and I think New Jersey might be developing one. So yes, definitely considering that. I think based off of where we are right now, your best bet would be to go look at the public participation plan and the section, I think it's section 7 of underserved community outreach, and look at that. And by no means is that you need to do all of those things. That's a list of ideas that we suggest. And so I think that would be a really good place to start right now, but yeah.
Okay. Next one is there directional guidance? Ooh, just scrolled away from me, I apologize. The next one is there directional guidance on how EJ is applied? Have applicable EJ requirements been adopted with the opportunity for public participation? Sorry, I lost my spot there for public participation, as any other DEQ requirement would follow, or will there be sort of a continuation of applicability through policy? Which I think is similar to the question about developing that guidance document and having a group of people who are participating and what the final substance of that looks like.
Yes. This question, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not positive I'm understanding the question other than the guidance, and I would just point back to the public participation plan at this point is the best place to start.
Next question is whether there is a way to view EJ reports that have already been completed. That's on the EJ website, right?
Yes, that's correct. So right when I open that presentation, if you go to the DEQ webpage under Education and Outreach and Environmental Justice, then on the side, there's like a blue sidebar. It has information about our EJ and Equity Advisory Board, the Community Mapping System, and the EJ reports are one of those items. And so you can access all of those there.
Next question is, we've got, boy, they keep coming in and I keep losing my spot. Is there a location on the DEQ website that provides a list of the types of permits that would be subject to this process?
Yes. Well, we're working on that. It's in the process. It is forthcoming. It will be out soon.
Next question is whether the EJ process is only really intended for or expected to be applied in the permitting process, or are there opportunities for the public to use these resources to engage with DEQ in terms of enforcement?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Obviously, this presentation has really been focusing on the permitting process and the outreach and opportunities in that process. But I know several other states, I know California especially, they definitely use environmental justice on enforcement and compliance of existing facilities. So not really the focus of what we've talked about today, but definitely as we're expanding our program and seeing what comes from the federal government, that is definitely a possibility.
Next question is, are there elements that DEQ would look for in a community benefits agreement? Is there any sort of guidance that you can offer?
So I think the EPA has several documents with more information on community benefits agreements. As I said, that is something that is not, DEQ is not involved in that. So it would not have to be approved by DEQ. So we don't have anything that we are looking for. What would be looked for is what the community would want and what they can agree to, and what the applicant would want and what the applicant can agree to. So it's not anything that DEQ has to approve, but there are some guidance documents out there on community benefits agreements.
And a clarification about the earlier question, and more stated this way instead, which was, do we continue doing EJ via, sort of policy and guidance, or would your expectation be that this is codified in rules at some point?
Right. Okay. At this point, it is still the policy. I wouldn't be surprised based off of what we're seeing at the federal level, and other states like New Jersey. I wouldn't be surprised if something more came with rules and requirements in the future.
And then the last question that we have is, will each division have its own implementation policy? Will there be certain exempt approvals by divisions that will not go through this as sort of a presumptive matter? For example, would a 401 certification for a simple core nationwide permit approval need to go through the EJ process? And I know that you're not a permitting expert, but I guess maybe the question stated more broadly is whether there would be some sort of division specific discussion about the equivalent of like categorical exemptions or something like that from this process.
Right. So definitely under that division director discretion, that's a really big piece. We work really, really closely with the division directors. I think I've even presented in the past with Director Abrazinskis from Air Quality on a dual presentation because we so closely work with the division director. So it's possible, again, as this case by case basis, it's definitely possible. And we do consider everything on each division while we work with the division directors.
Got it. All right, well, we have 1 minute until our 15-minute break. So thank you again to our panelists for participating today. Please don't forget in the next 15 minutes to visit the lounges for networking opportunities, and we will continue the program at 10 a.m. back on the main stage. Thanks a lot, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.